Hello, everybody. We are waiting for attendees to join our conference. You have the title up on the slide, Anti-Caste Thought, Theory, Politics, and Culture. We'll just give a few minutes because there are a large number of people who have registered to join the conference. And as soon as we have a sufficient number, we will start. So let's give it a couple of minutes. Here we are. Hello, I am Professor Meena Dhanda. I am organizing this conference along with Dr. Karthick Ram Manoharan, as you saw on the welcome slide. And Karthick Ram Manoharan is Marie Curie Skoda Research Fellow at the University of Wolverhampton. And we are both working on a project, an EU Horizon 2020 project, as you saw. So without taking any further time, I'm going to invite Karthick to kindly welcome you all, and we will straight go into panel one as soon as Karthick finishes his welcome address.
Thank you so much. We welcome you all to our conference, Anti-Caste Thought, Theory, Politics and Culture. This conference is a part of the EU Horizon 2020 project, Freedom From Caste, the political thought of Periyar E.V. Ramasamy in a global context. And this project has received funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Program under the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Grant Agreement number 895514. I am the researcher on this project and Professor Meena Dhanda is the principal investigator. I just want to add a few lines on this project to give you an idea of what is it that we are doing over here. This project, to the best of my knowledge, is the first internationally funded research project on Periyar. Over the course of this project, what I intend to do is to provide a systematic and coherent account of the political thoughts of Periyar, relying on the voluminous primary material of his writings and speeches, which were published as 37 volumes by the Periyar Kalanjiyam. My work is largely one of intellectual history, but I also draw much from political theory and philosophy and take an interdisciplinary approach. You can find a list of my academic publications on the project website, theperiyarproject.com, and in due time, there will also be good news of a new monograph, an edited volume, and some academic articles on Periyar. For now, I'm happy to announce that my short monograph on Periyar and religion has been accepted for publication and is soon forthcoming. Do also follow us on the Twitter handle CasteFreeH2020 for further updates on this project. This conference is one of our project outputs, and it arose tied to a call for papers for a special issue of the journal J-Caste, which was announced in February 2021. We received several excellent proposals, and after a careful process of review, we selected a limited number of papers for submission to the journal and another set for the conference. Now, some of the speakers here are contributing to both the journal and the conference, and we hope that the other contributors to the journal are present here as well. All papers submitted to the journal by the deadline we have mentioned will go through a further process of peer review, and we wish all of you much luck. For our speakers here, who are here with us today, a very warm welcome, and we are all very eager to hear your presentations. And a very special thanks to our chairs who have taken time of their busy schedules to be with us today. They are the leading experts in their fields and the authors of path-breaking academic works in political theory, film studies, sociology, critical caste studies, critical geography, and philosophy, to name a few disciplines. It will be very tough for me to list out their remarkable interventions, so I will just ask the audience to have a look at their names on Google Scholar to get an idea of the output that these scholars have produced over the years. We are very honored to have you as chairs here, and we are sure that our paper presenters will benefit greatly from your feedback. At the end of today's session, we will have a book discussion of the 5-volume B.R. Ambedkar, The Quest for Justice. We have the privilege of having the editor of this highly important work, Akash Singh Rathod, who will be in conversation with some brilliant contributors to the volume, namely Kancha Ilaya, Kanchana Mahadevan, and Matthew Baxter. This book discussion panel will be chaired by our own Meena Dhanda, who is also a contributor to this amazing volume. We have a keynote lecture tomorrow morning. A.R. Venkata Jalapati, the foremost historian of modern Tamil Nadu, will be speaking on Denying and Defying Power, Periyar's Approach to Politics. It may be early in the morning for some of you, but I request our attendees to take the trouble to miss a bit of sleep for this lecture because you will gain a lot. Let me now thank the University of Wolverhampton for providing us the platform for this academic conference, and also to our excellent technical support team, Elena and Mike, for assisting us. I also thank Lotika Singha and Partha Chakrabarti for their help and their advice. Now, the purpose of this conference as such is to have academic conversations on anti-caste thinkers across India. While Dr. Ambedkar is almost universally known across India and perhaps even South Asia, some key anti-caste thinkers from the south of India may not be that well known in the north. And likewise, some key anti-caste thinkers from the east may not be that well known in the west. We hope to facilitate stimulating intellectual conversations in an atmosphere of respectful debate among young and established scholars on these thinkers, their legacies, and their impacts. We humbly acknowledge in our endeavors that these anti-caste thinkers faced unimaginable hurdles in their times, and we take due note that discussion of many of these thinkers was not prominent in intellectual debates for long. There were and there are attempts at slandering such thinkers and silencing informed debates about them. Some of the attendees here might remember the hatchet job called Worshipping False Gods by one right-wing journalist who used to be a prominent commentator in his time. This shoddy unacademic work cherry-picked quotes from Ambedkar to show him as a British collaborator and an anti-national, whatever that means. As far as Periyar is concerned, there are very similar attacks too by caste supremacists of much lesser prominence and relevance. I'm sure my friends here can identify such attacks on other anti-caste thinkers. I would say that good scholarship is the best response to such anti-intellectual attacks. Senior scholars in this conference today, like Dag Eric Berg, Meena Dhanda, and Scott Stroud, have made significant contributions in taking Ambedkar to an international academic audience. The 5 volumes on B.R. Ambedkar, edited by Akash Singh Rathore, are nothing short of historic. Scholarship on Periyar and the Dravidian movement is robustly growing and has challenges and critical questions to face, and I hope I will be dealing with them adequately in my own work. I am confident that our presenters here will also contribute to the growing academic literature on anti-caste thought. This conference is a very good step in that direction. Now, I remember telling in a lecture I made in India several years back that these anti-caste thinkers from the different parts of India were a constellation of heroes. We need to read them separately, read them together, in comparison, in dialogue, in respectful difference, and ultimately in synthesis, if at all we are to make sense of the social, political, religious, and philosophical issues that we face today. I thank you all again for being here today. Let us now begin a great academic event. Cheers.
Thank you, Karthik. Thank you very much. And I think we will, I just want to say to all the attendees, you should be able to see a Q&A button on your screen. As soon as the speakers start, and as soon as you feel you have a question to ask, please enter your question in the Q&A. This will be picked up by us as well as by the chair, and it will be answered online. Please bear with us. It's not likely at all that all of the questions will be answered because of the numbers that are attending. So if you feel that you needed your question to be answered after the conference, we'll be free to accept questions via email to castfree@wlv.ac.uk, and we will reply to you by that forum if we aren't able to hold it now. So I would like to invite our first chair to please, Selvaraj, to kindly start the session, the panel 1, and introduce the speakers, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Meena. And thank you also to Karthik for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be joining you guys. My name is Selvaraj Velayutham. I'm based in Sydney, Macquarie University, in the Department of Sociology. Before I start the proceeding, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of Macquarie University, where my campus is based, and the Watamatagal clan, and we're part of the Dalit nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture the land that we live. We want to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And with that, I just want to say that the panel for this, the first session is on caste and culture. And we've got three excellent speakers. As required by the proceeding, I will just introduce all the three speakers, and thereafter I'll do a kind of commentary on their talk, and we then open up for question and answer. So the first speaker is Sunidhi Pacharne, and she's pursuing a Master of Philosophy in the Center for Politics Studies from JNU, New Delhi. Her research is focused on Dalit women's temporal touchability to understand the relationship between desire and stigma, which she does by studying intercaste relationship of Dalit persons. And her paper for this session is titled "The Gendered Politics of Caste in Indian Cinema, Interrogating the Sexual Impurity of Dalit Women." And second speaker is Drishadwati Bargi. She's a doctoral candidate in the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. She's working on religiosity in Dalit literature and cinema, exploring the relationship between religion and justice. She works at the intersection of cultural studies and political philosophy. And her paper is titled "Revolution in the Mirror of Love, Facing the Failures in Malika Amar Sheikh's memoir, I Want to Destroy Myself." The final speaker is Professor Swaranvel Iswaran, who is based at Michigan State University in the Department of English and Journalism. We have collaborated quite a bit ourselves with work on Tamil cinema. And so his research area is indeed in Indian and Tamil cinema and documentary films. He's the author of Madras Studios, Narrative Genre and Ideology in Tamil Cinema. And his recent films include Nagapattinam in 2018, documentary on tsunami relief and rehabilitation, and Katumaram, a feature-length fiction, which is on the film festival circuit. So and his paper is titled "Caste, Cinema and Speciality." So without ado, I'll welcome Sunidhi to present her paper.
Thank you. I'm Sunidhi, and my paper is titled "The Gendered Politics of Caste in Indian Cinema, Interrogating the Sexual Impurity of Dalit Women." And I will dive right into the paper since Professor Selvaraj has given my introduction already. The state, religion, and normal have come under attack for something so mundane, yet transcendent as desire. The state's grandiose brought to its knees, the indisputable religion disputed, and the consensus of the normal dissented. In the Indian state, honor politics is run through the mass campaign against a love jihad to protect the fragility of the Hindu man's sense of self and nation under the guise of protecting the Hindu woman. The politics of honor is played in the regulation of sexual and marital preferences on the slippery plains of caste. The imagination of these dominant forces considers the cisgendered, heterosexual, endogamous married couple as the only accepted sexual liaison. Any desire inconsistent is punished with excommunication from one's kin and caste and often results in death, popularly euphemized as honor killing. Ambedkar explores the crux of the caste system as that of fundamentally indispensable endogamy and thereby a system of graded inequalities. He concludes that women are gateways of the caste system since women's bodies endure the burden of endogamy. Tanika Sarkar, Patricia Uberoy, and Indrani Chatterjee have explored through the cultural and historical records of India that the family as a naturally heterosexual, endogamous, and monogamous form is far from the only configuration of domestic reproductive or sexual relations to be observed. Yet, these relationships are unacknowledged or criminalized regularly for their power to disrupt. My paper considers cinema as a tool to unfold the politics of intercaste relationships in which one of the partners is a Dalit person. I interrogate the articulation of anti-caste and feminist politics in mainland India and their treatment of intercaste relationships wherein Dalit women are concerned. I do this to argue that there is a certain refusal of movements to engage with intercaste relationships of Dalit women that reproduces the caste Hindu logic of the Dalit woman as sexually impure and also the upper caste progressive imagination of Dalit women as mere passive victims of abuse. Around 12 million people watch films in cinema houses and theaters every week, making it a prominent medium of communication. Amit Dillon draws attention to the crisis of representation in the Hindi film industry by stating that in the 104 years of its existence, as of 2018, there is no Dalit star. There is therefore no question of looking at the representations of Dalits in Bollywood due to their obvious negligibility. This results in narratives, characters, and fictions formulated by and of upper caste people. Harish Wankhede writes, Hindi films are written, directed, and produced by a dominant set of people that celebrate the tastes and values of upper class caste sensitivities. Even critics, historians, and scholars have studied cinema as an art aloof from the rugged, conflicting social realities. The experiences of caste discrimination and exclusion have a negligible presence in the narratives of the Bollywood cinema. Referring to a study done by The Hindu in 2015, which shows that of the 300 Bollywood movies in 2013-14, 6 lead characters were backward caste characters and no Dalits. Suraj Yangde uses this to argue that the extension of the historical exclusion in modern forms of expression, the screen being one of them, is more visible than ever. Harish Wankhede, Vidushi, and Suraj Yangde argue that the Indian cinema sustains a dominant caste hegemony, and in the rare cases that it does include Dalit characters, it shows them as subservient, wretched, unchallenging, passive recipients of violence and oppression, seeking no justice, submissive, degraded, powerless, and destitute without any hope. They argue that when the occasional hope does appear in such cinema, it is brought about by upper caste protagonists by positioning them as the enlightened agents of social transformation, rescuing the Dalits. At the same time, the Dalits continue to remain social outcasts dependent upon the morality of the social elites. Such narratives can be observed in Achut Kanya, Sujata, Lagan, Swades, Arakshan, and Article 15. As Wankhede succinctly observes, the Dalit movement, which has impacted the socio-political churning in the most impressive way and produced a robust, independent political Dalit, has almost no representative narrative available in the mainstream Bollywood films. Up until very recently, the only viable area that demonstrated the life worlds of Dalits at the center of their narratives was a string of parallel cinema, which continued with the superficial populist stereotypes of marginalized lives without addressing issues that will agitate or cause discomfort to their audiences. It is interesting to note here that it is only in parallel cinema where Dalits have a caste. In most mainstream cinema until recently, characters that are visibly lower class, anti-system, toiling, clearly working lower caste jobs never had any caste. The one important way in which parallel cinema stood out from the commercial one was by making its characters persons with marked identities. While Bollywood has been a significant contributor to the maintenance of caste hegemony by normalizing and generalizing respectability, honor, and pride that Hindu customs and cultural practices of a minuscule population has. It has made sure that caste was a visible marker only when the people associated had reason to have caste pride. That is perhaps why the central characters of most movies were heroes who were larger than life and mostly Thakur, Gupta, Sharma, Singhania, Malhotra, Shukla, and the likes. Despite the seamless effort of Bollywood to look like it has no caste consideration, it clearly knows which characters to venerate by giving them an identity and attaching stories, symbols, and meanings to them that reinforce their cause to have caste pride. Parallel cinema differed majorly from such mainstream ones and tried to identify the locations of its characters explicitly. What it could not do is to release its upper caste gaze for these characters. The characters continued to remain subservient, helpless, and passive without a hint of fight in them. Even when there was an attempt to expose caste for its atrocious nature, it built a character only for the upper caste oppressor. The Dalits stayed mute in most cases and pleading or quietly submissive in the rest. This has to be a consequence of the hegemony of upper caste individuals in the filmmaking process. It is almost as if they just do not know what Dalit characters do or say in their ordinary lives and hence could not write any characterization for them. The cinema then that breaks these stereotypes comes in the form of Mukta, Fandri, Kabali, Sairat, Kala, and Periyar and Perumal that break the dominant visuals of even violence and oppression, portray Dalit lives with more shades than viewed with an upper caste lens, consciously articulate Dalit assertion, and make way for a radical imagination of Dalit subjectivities. Mukta, Sairat, and Periyar and Perumal have in common the protagonist as an educated, college-going Dalit student who seeks companionship from the upper caste woman and rebels against the odds of parental policing of the upper caste woman's family, who vehemently denies such unions, often with violence. In all three movies, the relationships are rejected due to the difference in their class and caste and take form of a constant humiliation of the Dalit man. In Mukta, the movie, protagonist Milind is reprimanded by Mukta's grandfather, uncle, as well as the Brahmin advisor/employee. There are attempts made at showing him his place. In the movie Sairat, Pasha is humiliated in public and beaten up. In the movie Periyar and Perumal, the protagonist is brutally beaten up and urinated upon by Jyoti's male relatives. Of the movies, only Achi, the heroine of Sairat, is fully aware of the state of affairs around her and uses her power as an upper caste woman to defend and protect them both. Jyoti and Mukta, on the other hand, are innocent, pure, unconditionally loving their Dalit lovers since they are so entirely oblivious to the caste feudality around them. The above movies reflect on the socio-political upheavals, paint narratives of Dalit defiance against conformity of oppression without catering to normative upper caste aesthetics. These films are created by exceptional persons like Nagraj Manjari and Pa Ranjit, who anchor their anti-caste politics in their work. These movies, therefore, are not just of the casteless poor standing up to the feudal landlords. The men in Mukta and Periyar and Perumal are very explicitly and proudly Ambedkarite and live lives according to anti-caste principles. These movies not only make Dalit cinematically layered subjects, they also pave a way for the normalcy of anti-caste symbols to exist in the mainstream. Having said this, the sting that can be observed in such movies is the uniformity of relations, despite the several other nuances that these films offer. These movies, like others, Masan, Pandri, Arakshan, focus on the Dalit male lead who would invariably fall for the upper caste woman. It has been evident in the arguments summarized above that it has so far been impossible for those who own the film industry to even have Dalit characters in the first place, and not misrepresented once in the other. Even the alternate cinema participated in reinforcing cultural stereotypes of the subservient passive Dalit. So the question remains why the new wave of cinema that has been challenging these norms of both cinema and society by showcasing stories of radical subversion of caste endogamy just cannot imagine the Dalit woman's intercaste relationships as a valid threat to the caste society. The Dalit woman has been the subject of cinema wherein she's inadvertently the raped or abused victim, unable to revolt or respond. Kalpana and Vasant Kanabiran explore the aspect of Dalit women's lives, which is characterized by the status of being workers, an essential component of why they are viewed as women without shame. They write that the women who work cannot rid themselves of being treated as sex objects. They say, sexual access, ranging from small intimacies right through to actual intercourse, is often assumed to be part of the working. The uniform stereotype with abuse as her only experience has been attributed to her presence in the public sphere. If there is a tacit acknowledgement of her abundant involvement in the public, it is inconceivable how one cannot think of her beyond a docile victim of abuse. The protagonist of Mukta, Milind, in his rage towards fellow activists who are upper caste, asks as a response to their question of why he makes the issue of the de-rope paraded Dalit woman. He asks, when in the city, when a woman dies of a dowry murder, you create so much commotion. His friends comment that it is not just the question of a Dalit woman. Milind responds to it emphatically. She has no independent movement for her, no feminist magazine that caters to her, no pressure group in the police's peace committee. What will she do but sit quiet in her shame? He organizes a protest with his fellow Ambedkarites who are invariably men and upper caste comrades, both men and women, who barely support the assertion of the Dalit man, let alone of the Dalit woman. His outrage, although a poignant critique of the mainstream feminist and socialist movements in Maharashtra at the time, also draws a glaring light on the anti-caste movement. The premise of Dalit women having an autonomous movement and politics for themselves assumes that the anti-caste movement is a bastion of Dalit men. The product of this is visible in the themes of the radical shift from the mainstream cinema, wherein there is a negligible exploration of Dalit women's subjectivities. The category of Dalit conflates to mean a Dalit man, and the explosive potential of resistance, the Dalit man's exclusive domain. Intercaste relationships that posit a threat to the caste patriarchal order are then at their farthest end articulated and portrayed as those of Dalit men with upper caste women. If the examination of consensual intercaste relationships of Dalit women with upper caste men provides nuances, it will be inconsistent with the construction of the Dalit woman as a perennial victim of rape. Saujanya Tamal Pakula, conducts interviews of participants of intercaste marriages to argue that the position of Dalit women as sexually impure has not been challenged by movements espousing social transformations because of the consequence it would have to their conjugality. She posits Fanon's argument that the white woman's desirability is a product of colonial racist hierarchy, hence a road to realization of the black man. Though the white man can cohabitate with any woman, his children with black women are illegitimate since the mother does not obtain the status of a wife. She superimposes this argument to the Dalit situation to show that the Dalit women are seen as regular wives, while upper caste women as intellectual partners by Dalit men. She argues that the seeking of companionship from the upper caste men is seen as an act of betrayal by the Dalit community, hence sanctioned with apathy or hostility towards it. Sharmila Rege states that Ambedkar asserts, no one's private sphere, not even that of gods, is free from critique. Ambedkar pioneers the enmeshing of the gendered politics of caste with the private sphere of intimacy and marriage by even analyzing Krishna's marriage to 8 women, most of whom were Kshatriyas, and his maintenance of lower caste women as sexually accessible concubines. Lower caste women as concubines or the extra women has been occasionally referred to in Hindu scriptures without according them with the status of wife. Vijaya Bharti mentions that even Harishchandra does not marry Matangi Kanyas, just as Krishna does not marry Yadava women. This is to argue that there is a certain refusal of movements to engage with the intercaste marriages of Dalit women that reproduces the caste Hindu logic of Dalit women as sexually impure. And also the upper caste progressive imagination of Dalit women as mere passive victims of abuse. It works to deny them the subjectivities otherwise available to all upper castes and now slowly being accorded to Dalit men. It denies them the potential of their actions in the private sphere of intimacy, family, and marriage to have radical meaning or consequence. Instead of a conclusion, I offer a conversation. When the movie Sairat was played by a few neighboring families in my village, the popular song Yard Lagla played. Soni, my childhood friend, whispered in my ear while giggling, "Aplyala kadi yard lagaयचं ग? When will we be affected by such madness?" She probably meant that she is waiting for her to love somebody, but really, even if she did, would Soni's yard be consequential to have songs, books, or movies to be made of? Or would it be erased, since it does not exist in the confines of the concubine victim narrative, even if it is consensual? With that, I would like to conclude. Thank you so much for having me here. And I give it off to Professor Selvaraj.
We'll have the next speaker, I think.
My video has been disabled. So. Thank you, Meena. Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me clearly. So I will start my paper. Revolution in the Mirror of Love, Facing the Failures in Malika Amar Sheikh's memoir, I Want to Destroy Myself. Malika Amar Sheikh is a contemporary Marathi poet and political activist. Although not a Dalit poet herself, she can be regarded as a witness and critical interlocutor of the now defunct Dalit Pantha movement due to her companionship with the founder poet Namdev Dhasal, whom she married at the age 16. A recent anthology of contemporary Marathi poetry has included her along with contemporary Dalit poets. Her poetry revolves around the modern questions of women's identity, love, and complexities of freedom. The tone is often of tragic irony. Just to give an example, one of the titles of her poem is Mukti Kis Janjeer Ka Naam. What kind of chain is freedom? In this paper, I attempt to trace the refrain of self-destruction that keeps on coming up in her translated memoir, I Want to Destroy Myself. I juxtapose this refrain in relation to a self-mediated or self-centered revolutionary politics that I elicit from the philosophy of Hannah Arendt and Immanuel Kant. I show how the paradoxical desire for self-destruction and expression of its failure may point at a critique of revolutionary politics that we have experienced in India, a politics that foregrounds self-sacrifice as a means of attaining freedom. I show that this critique is generated via the power of memory and the role of memory in the text. The very title of the memoir, I Want to Destroy Myself, foregrounds the self's desire for destruction. And such self-destructive declarations are made repeatedly in the memoir, alongside declarations of solidarity with the women of the world. For instance, she writes in the very first few pages, I have peeled away the skin of my life and served it up to you. Some of this fruit is indelible, but it doesn't matter. It is more important for me to present this very different world of experience in which I have lived, telling the story from my point of view and the point of view of all the women who have been exploited. Unquote. Self destruction here is harnessed to the confessor's dilemma. Telling one's story is no different from the painful process of peeling away one's skin. The proverb is not a coincidence here. As Sundar Sarukar reminds us, the skin is a mark of identity, what can arguably be called an Indian understanding of the person. The phrase shedding one's skin is often used to refer to sudden change of character. To tell about one's own life or to remember is akin to the painful act of peeling away one's skin skin of one's own life, and therefore to changing oneself. But this painful peeling is necessary. She writes in the next sentence, as long as women don't put off the garment of shame and inhibition and tolerant self-sacrifice, we will all take her oppression as given. Unquote. Towards the end of the memoir, this call for destruction is repeated. But this time it is about writing shamelessly. Here you see my naked face scarred by suffering, hunger, anger, and pain. We all have a streak of violence hidden in us somewhere. I have one too. Unquote. But here it is slightly modified by adding an injunction against sacrifice. We should no longer believe that it is our duty to live in the shadow of our husbands and endure, with our magnificence of spirit and our ability to sacrifice whatever is meted out to us. Unquote. This ambiguity about pain, destruction, and sacrifice is performed throughout her narrative. On the one hand, there is a desire for revolutionary change that gets expressed in the desire for destruction. On the other hand, there is painful awareness that the self sacrifice that revolution demands may simply be another worthless death with effects all too familiar and banal. Love becomes the very site where this ambiguity about self destruction becomes manifest. In contemporary philosopher Ali Badiou's opinion, love is an existentialist, that is, a worldly project that may construct the world from a decentered point of view other than our mere impulse to survive or reaffirm our identity. Much like revolutionary sacrifice, love is constitutive of the idea of simultaneous loss of one's given identity and creation of a new world. Much like revolution, love too is predicated on a certain sacrifice of one's ego via the renunciation of one's self-interest. This loss generates questions, doubts, and reflections. The memoir begins with a meditative poetry on love, where the poet defines love in the following way. Love, a mirror made of leather in which one's reflection is horrifying. Love, sometimes a piece of bread. Love, a drop of blood secreted by the body. Once outside, it no longer belongs to you. The mirror of love does not reflect a free self. It is horrifying and predicated upon the all too familiar objects of bread and blood, that is, hunger and caste. Yet, despite this, the poet asks, where does such love come from? And answers, I don't know, I don't know. The voiding of consciousness upon which revolution depends is inescapably repeated in this meditation on love, despite one's disappointment with the latter. Even in its failure, love repeats the revolutionary annihilation. The tragic paradox is that the voiding only makes the self languish in the recollection of the drudgery of a poor household, of hunger, disease, and domestic fights, instead of offering the freedom that revolution promises. In a response to Franz Fanon's evocation of destructive violence and martyrdom as the means of freedom, in her book on revolution, Hannah Arendt writes that violence, whether destructive of the self or the other, is not an adequate measure of revolutionary change. Only when change occurs in the sense of a new beginning and violence is used to constitute an altogether different form of government, and while the liberation from oppression aims at least at the constitution of freedom, can we speak of revolution. Arendt's conjugation of destructive violence, change, and freedom to constitute a new government posits the phenomena of revolution as already accommodating the problem of dynamism and continuity. Revolution is not just any change, but a paradoxical fixing of the change as the foundation of a new order. If it is a question of the constitution of a new collective, it carries within it a complexity. The violence is not just a physical act of injury or destruction, but foundational. This act of constitution of the new is simultaneously the experience or enactment of freedom. The pathos of revolution for Arendt lies in this aspect of revolution. Revolution coincides with the discovery of man's freedom and the latter's faculty for beginning something new. On many occasions, revolutionary destruction and the crisis it generates creates projects of individual moral behavior and self-transformation. Perhaps the focus on the self or the subjective revolution had its first articulation in Immanuel Kant's reception of the French Revolution. In his Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, Kant states the problem of revolution and the strategy for the latter's preservation by thinking through Christianity. Within this universe, Kant regarded Christ's sacrifice as the greatest revolution, thereby turning revolution into a moral question, a question of attitude. For Kant, revolution involves the willingness on part of the human being to not only perform the moral duty himself, but also become the example and spread it far and wide. The exit from the old life involves moral sacrifice. Although Kant does not explicitly state what could be the ordinary equivalent of Christ's crucifixion, which among other things involves physical pain, one can perhaps think of these sacrifices in terms of pangs of conscience and the pain of giving up. Some of this Kantian echo of an internalized and subjective revolution can be found in the making of the communist ethos in India, as has been diagnosed by the cultural historians like Rajarshi Dasgupta, Anya Lumba, Srila Roy, and many more. In her Giving an Account of Oneself, Judith Butler diagnoses a symptom of moral philosophy and moral action that can be useful in connecting the conception of revolutionary sacrifice and the genre of the memoir that I'm discussing here. Butler observes that moral questions are often raised when collective ethos outlive their significance. So the Indian communists had to take recourse to the construction of a new ethos of masculine self-sacrifice because the ethos they had inherited from the Indian nationalists and the latter's hegemonic commitment to non-violence had proved to be insufficient for revolutionary politics. These individualistic moral actions have an element of resistance inbuilt into their formulation. Albeit individual and often internal, these actions can be a means of escaping dominant ethical collective and rigid social mores. However, as these individualized moral actions are undertaken by beings in the social realm, giving an account of oneself to other constitutes these moral actions fundamentally. Not all account of the self stems from a concern for the wrong or from one's own conscience. However, all moral acts are fundamentally narrative acts. It is no irony that much of contemporary narrative theory is focused on the role of self-narration in responding to historical wrongs and trauma. Not all of them are accounts of pangs of conscience. Some of them are survivors' narrative that do not demand retributive justice and instead seek healing. Despite this diversity, their proliferation affirms the centrality of self-narration in responding to crisis or violent events. Susan Brisson, for instance, points out that survivors of trauma often regard narratives of witnessing as a way towards reintegration with the self and society in the aftermath of trauma's undoing of self. What these narratives or accounts need are not just words with which the stories are told, but an audience able and willing to hear and understand what the survivors utter. The stories that are told are often not a matter of choice, as there are perceptual and emotional flashbacks, and the telling itself out of control, compulsively repeated. The events narrated need not be accurate as the subject of memory is not the legal individual person. These narratives reveal processes of working through trauma and are often inventive of memories and selves that exceed the demands of accuracy and juridical veracity. I submit that the desire to speak, confess, give account of, and narrativize oneself is inseparable from the internalization and transformation of revolutionary violence through a moralistic and personal politics that I tracked in the above sections. Since the revolutions promise a new self or a new being, response to the revolution, albeit critical, cannot but be couched in an equally self-centered discourse. This can be gauged from the fact that much of the political writings from the subjects of revolution have been in the form of personal reflections, autobiography, memoirs, and confessionals in contemporary India. Their narratives enact and remember the fact that revolutionary politics is often accompanied by traumatic experiences of failure, police torture, hypocrisy, and personal loss. But by expressing loss via the genre of personal recollections or autobiography, they are in some sense repeating the personalization of revolutionary politics that the middle class communists are guilty of in India. In this respect, they are also heir to the Kantian moralization of French Revolution and its notion of sacrificial, self-wounding subject. In Malika Amar Sheikh's narrative, there are many moments where love is experienced only as sacrifice. But on some occasions, this remembrance is often disturbed by lapses and gaps. In one of the episodes, Sheikh remembers a time when the couple had got stuck in the heavy rains of Mumbai. She was completely drenched and was menstruating. They got their first shelter in a boys' hostel. Next day, they went to comrade's house and found shelter. This is how she describes this episode. I gave up all my embarrassment and simply asked his wife for a change of clothes. She was a good woman. She gave me a sari and everything else I needed. By then, Namdeo had gone home, swimming half the way. Since the water had entered the ground floor, everyone had taken shelter on the first floor. Namdeo counted his money. He bought bread for 50 rupees and 4.5 dozen bananas and gave it to them. Then he came back. I developed a fever after that. That memory will never fade. Unquote. In this memory, we get to witness a Christ-like Dhasal, a failure as a romantic partner and equally terrible political actor. Dhasal emerges as an impossible saint who is ready to denude himself of the last of his possessions and help strangers in need. Unsurprisingly, this act of self-sacrifice leaves Sheikh in shock and despair. The narrative ends abruptly. She refuses to draw any conclusion from this episode. All she can do is narrate how she developed fever afterwards. How must we read this abrupt suspension of narration and its resumption with the declaration that memory will never fade? Who is the addressee of this last statement? What are we to make of this silence? The self that remembers this journey and Dhasal's sacrifice, and the self that declares that the memory will never fade, is disjointed by a momentary pause, the memory of the fever. Being feverish, the self cannot remember what happened afterwards. But we as readers can guess very easily that the effect must have been predictably pauperizing for a family without a steady source of income. Therefore, through this fever, what is achieved is a silent solidarity with Dhasal's sacrificial love. She momentarily erases her voice and enacts a self-destruction of sorts, just as Dhasal had drained the last of his resources that day. Through this failure of memory and therefore the erasure of one's own voice, the reader is strategically summoned to gauge what disaster must have befallen Sheikh. But Sheikh refuses to spell it out for us. And now I'll conclude. In his article on the function of memory in contemporary fictionalization of Naxalbari movements, cultural theorist Anirban Das notes that memories are ongoing note on the multiple stories of the individual. They may create moments of identification with heterogeneous others and make place for figures that are often rejected by revolutionaries' absolutist emphasis on separation from the ordinary needs and vulnerabilities that come from the fragile and mortal body. Given the slippery and the evasive character of the self of the memoir, the genre produces a self that must perform a discontinuous continuity and suturing of sorts instead of cessation and annihilation that revolutionary sacrifice demands. In this memoir, the fevered and menstruating body of Sheikh is perhaps one such self that interrogates the revolutionary sacrifice of Namdeo Dhasal and projects that valorize such sacrifice. Thank you.
Over to you, Swarnawale.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Velayutham, Professor Dhanda, Professor Ram Manoharan, and my fellow panelists, Sunidhi, Pacharne, and Drishadwati Bargi. So I will start, with sharing my PowerPoint. So my presentation is on caste and cinema and spatiality. Let me how do I? Okay, so I'm focusing on these three films: Madati by director Leena Manimegalai, 2019, Periyar Perumal, or the horse-mounted deity, by director Mari Selvaraj, 2018, and the same director's next film, Karnan, 2021. So these are the posters, just to give you an idea about the film. And I am interested in these films because all these three films are shot on locales, in and near Tirunelveli, which is like the southernmost point you can see in the map. So I am positing them, arguing for them as Tirunelveli subgenre of films against the theorization of the Madurai genre of films. Madurai, if you look at, is slightly towards the north. So I am positing in this essay that these films strongly contend for. So these are the the Madurai genre of films, which I will now read from my paper. This presentation engages with Madathi, Periyar and Karnan to explore the way space is constructed as a marker of caste and to interrogate the marginalization as well as the rebellion of Dalits. While these films focus on the oppression of Dalits from the mythical past to contemporary times, they also challenge the hegemony of the dominant caste and the rigidly casteist Tamil society through the retooling of myths, Madathi, and the challenging of the status quo, Periyar and by responding to the violence of the state, which acts as a spokesperson for the upper caste, by challenging it despite the totally unjust violence and heavy loss, Karnan. However, such diverse responses to the continuing oppression of the dominant upper caste people converge in these films in their objective of focusing on the predicament of Dalits and invoking Tirunelveli as the space for their narratives. In Madathi, areas surrounding Tirunelveli, I'll just put Madathi, particularly the forest region and the Tamarabarni River in Papanasam are invoked by shooting on location and matching such a space in locations near Virudunagar. Because she had the problems with permission because it's protected forest area. In contrast, Periyar and Karnan are mainly shot in actual locales in Tirunelveli, particularly near Puliyangulam, which is the birthplace of this prodigious young director Mari Selvaraj. So I am arguing for Mari Selvaraj as the preeminent Tirunelveli filmmaker who, in his mobilization of the spaces of the region, counters the quote-unquote Madurai genre of films predicated on the lives and times of the Tevar community by lending voice to the oppressed and erased Dalits, by juxtaposing caste and space and challenging the hegemony of the dominant caste and violence in contemporary times. My engagement with space in this film, Tirunelveli as its center, draws from and extends the arguments of Tamil cinema scholars Rajan Krishnan and Leonard Dickens. In his imaginary geographies, Krishnan posits Madurai as the pre-modern other of the civic Chennai in the context of recent Tamil cinema. Dickens, while drawing from Krishnan's compelling argument regarding the exteriorization / exoticization of the other, the south of Chennai, Madurai in this case, rearticulates the concept to focus on the facialization of caste in those Madurai genre of films, as exemplified by Kadal, director Balaji Saktivel, 2004, Veil, director Vasantha Balan, 2006, Parthiveeran, Amir Sultan, 2007, and Subramaniapuram, Shashi Kumar, 2008. Dickens also deconstructs Chennai as a coherent civic identity by pointing to the many films during the same period that draws from its underbelly for its gangster plots or as a backdrop for action sequences. I would like to extend these theoretical preoccupations into thinking about further othering Tirunelveli as the other of Madurai in the films released a decade after the significant Madurai genre films, which were predicated on heightened violence and the foregrounding of the troubled but resilient Tevar community. Dickens' third wave is essentially categorized around the complexity of narratives of the above four films, which he meticulously analyzes regarding the representation of caste, space, and the inclusion and exclusion of community, and the culture of and the rituals revolving around Madurai. In that case, could Madathi, Periyar and Karnan, in their intervention by engaging with the cast of their characters, by juxtaposing them with a particular space / place, be classified as signifying another wave or a tidal wave of caste within the third wave? More importantly, for my purposes, could we categorize them as Tirunelveli subgenre of films among the films from the south of Chennai in Tamil Nadu? Towards this end, this essay focused on the way these films explore space to discuss the iniquity, injustice, and inhumanity of caste, to claim these films as not only belonging to a legitimate subgenre revolving around the spaces of Tirunelveli among the films on caste, but also as an extension of Dalit cinema, as pioneered by the director P. Paranjit, where there is no ambiguity about the caste of the main characters. Additionally, these films are united by the interrogation of untouchability as a theme. However, in Modati, it is a dominant theme, whereas Mari Selvaraj films, though untouchability as a theme is ubiquitous, the narrative focuses on the spirit of the Dalits to challenge it as an individual or as a community. The reception of these films often engages with the identity of the filmmakers as non-Dalit, Leena Manimegale and Dalit Mari Selvaraj, to discuss their aesthetics and politics. Let me focus. So now, Modati, caste, gender, and myth-making as spaces of oppression and denial. Sorry, I got up at 3:30. It is 5 for me, so bear with me. The reception of Modati foregrounds the discourse surrounding Dalit Chetna or Dalit consciousness when it comes to writing about Dalits, whether in literature or films. Sharan Kumar Limbale, in his path-breaking and seminal book on Dalit criticism, defines it, quote, the revolutionary mentality connected with struggle, unquote. For him, quote, Ambedkar thought is the inspiration for this consciousness. Dalit consciousness makes slaves conscious of their slavery. Dalit consciousness is an important seed for Dalit literature. It is separate and distinct from the consciousness of other writers. Dalit literature is demarcated as unique because of this consciousness, unquote. He leaves no room for ambiguity. Quote, by Dalit literature, I mean writing about Dalits by Dalit writers with the Dalit consciousness, unquote. Laura Brooke, the eminent scholar on Hindi literature, gives us an idea about the complex and diverse ways the concept of Dalit Chetna is harnessed. Quote, it's a concept that frequently appears in discussions of Dalit politics and identity. It can at times refer to the notion of political awareness in the sense of consciousness raising among certain sections of the Dalit population, and other times refer to a collective notion of identity among diverse Dalit communities, unquote. The iconic Hindi writer Premchand's story Sadgati, 1931, and its adaptation in 1982 by Satyajit Ray also becomes point of contention and detailed critique between Dalit and non-Dalit writers and critics. In this context, the response of Dr. Tol Tirumavalavan, the Dalit activist thinker and the political leader from Tamil Nadu of Vidudalai Sirthai Katchi, attains significance. He responded to Modati after watching the film at the Chennai Independent Film Festival on Leena's invitation by appreciating the film, but also pointing to the space needed for the agency of Dalit women. Leena is a feminist writer, filmmaker who has a rich corpus of work over the last decade. She has many dimensions like being a poet, publisher, and activist. Against this backdrop, I'm invested in analyzing Modati regarding Leena's locus as a committed filmmaker who is invested in anti-caste and feminist discourses, whose earlier award-winning documentary, Goddesses, like much of her other films, engages with caste, class, and gender. In this essay, I want to focus on Modati's representation of caste and gender through space for its critique of masculinity and misogynistic Tamil culture. Anindita Datta draws from Joan Wallach Scott's definition of gender as predicated on, quote, perceived differences between the sexes and a primary way of signifying relations of power, and Judith Butler's, quote, styles of the flesh, unquote, to foreground how gender is socially constructed, not through biology, but performance or performing gender to be more precise. And in the case of Modati, through an, quote, incessant activity performed with or for another, unquote. To argue for how such performances, which have their own history and are socially determined, are rooted in particular spaces and geographic locale. Thus, according to Datta, the nature of space or location by itself determines to a large extent the manner in which the styles of the flesh, from Butler, or gender or performed. Conversely, these performances of gender may then in turn go on to constitute specific kinds of gendered spaces. Essentially, therefore, both gender and space eventually co-create each other, unquote. Datta posits the idea of the regional genderscape, particularly in the context of India, which has resonances for the way gender is constructed through space in Marathi. But even regional seems too broad a term to engage with the plight of the adolescent protagonist, Yosana of Marathi, who is marked in the film as the lowest in the caste hierarchy and personifying the most virulent oppression from men of the higher caste. Since we do not see her with other friends or relatives, any kind of rubric to explain her loneliness, alienation, and exploitation in terms of caste or gender seems inadequate to fully understand her predicament in a dangerously violent and ferociously caste society. The official press kit of the film informs us about Yosana as belonging to the unseeable among the Dalits. Quote, Pudurai Vannar is an unseeable Dalit caste group in southern India. Their forced occupation is to wash clothes for other Dalits, the dead and the menstruating woman. This film is a tale about a young girl who grew up in Pudurai Vannar caste group and how she came to be immortalized as a local deity, Madati. India is a land of subaltern deities. Each deity has a unique legend, and these legends are often interwoven with socio-historic tropes of India, unquote. My initial response was one of guilt, shock, and sadness, as I have to admit my ignorance as a non-Dalit scholar of the existence of such a community. I'm from a village which is within 25 miles from Pabanasam, which is very close to Anavan Kudirpu, the area around which a significant portion of the film was shot. It also undermines the general notion of the contemporary surveillance era where nothing escapes the possibilities of looking at and gazing back in return. Caste and its tentacles defy the ubiquity of the Foucauldian panopticon and its reach in the digital era, where Tamil Nadu is notorious for its CCTV culture, even in rural areas. More importantly, Marathi, set in contemporary times, foregrounds the failure and betrayal of the majoritarian Hindu society to fulfill the spirit of Baba Sahib Ambedkar instilled in the Indian constitution regarding the various means to achieve economic democracy. The plot revolves around lives and times of Yosana, played by Ajmina Qasim, and her mother Veni, Samalarana, her father Sudalai, grandmother Stella Raj, and the wandering mystic, her grandfather. In her quest, the lonely Yosana too wanders into the forest and the river and finds company in and consonance with nature, in the company of a rabbit and a parrot, and monkeys on the rocks and fishes in the water. More importantly, she finds a foal, the baby donkey that has moved away from the group, just like her, to explore the landscape secretly. She befriends her and helps her return to foal. This tranquil side of Yosana's life in pristine and mythical landscape is contrasted with the lived reality of her mother's anxiety surrounding Yosana's future and her carefree and vivacious nature. Her mother goes about the chore of washing clothes with the help of her father and steps out only for work and hurries back to escape, not only because she is unseeable, but mainly to keep away from the depraved and debauched man. She similarly wants to protect her daughter, who would not share concerns in her pursuit of the mysterious surrounding nature as well as desire. One of the remarkable scenes in Marathi is when Yosana is hiding behind a rock and later underwater as he sees a young man relieving himself of his clothes, jumping in bare body head-on into the water and swimming. Such a scene, shot from an adolescent girl's perspective, is unparalleled in Indian cinema in the way it punctuates female desire to explore the mystery surrounding the human body and sexuality. She would later be grabbing the stolen shirt, which the youngster had left to dry on the rock after washing, and walking away smelling it. Such tender scenes are juxtaposed with the harsh realities of her mother washing the clothes with menstrual blood and working hard to prepare the fire for steaming a considerable load of clothes. And later, her father waiting in the vicinity, but yet hiding from the pyre of the corpse, awaiting the clothes of the dead to be washed, and a bottle of country liquor as the tip. Her mother also inadvertently attracts a woodcutter's attention and rushes to hide behind the tree with the daughter. But this hypocrisy is revealed when he spits on her vessel. More sadly, all of her mother's apprehensions come true when she is molested and raped against her will. Later, Yosana too is subject to the same fate by a group of young men who are at odds till then in the backdrop of the festival to celebrate the new temple built by the village community. Leena bookends the film with the myth of Madati, the village deity, who took her form from the tragic narrative of a young woman like Yosana, whose life was nipped in the bud in a caste and conservative society, which did not seek the truth behind the dark realities of its cathartic rituals. I will now point to the main points. Later I go on to discuss. One of the things I feel which is very important in this film is the male gaze. Laura Mulvey's seminal work on male gaze has been theorized in the context of Psycho, particularly regarding the murder sequence when he is peeping through Norman Bates. But here, that we can think of the house of Norman Bates itself as this haunting, gazing thing. But I would like to extend that argument, that the caste itself becomes the thing which is constantly haunting, and we can see that how even if this entire pristine land is there, but it looks so contained, it's so claustrophobic in the way it is. The next point, I'll briefly talk about. Despite the borderless space essence of claustrophobia, the motif of the red color, which bookends the film, because initially it starts, with a story within a story, and then that red color, the menstrual blood, it kind of it is woven through as a text, till the end, when you see the red dot on the Amman and Marathi herself, and also the paintings which the film begins. We see it ends with the painting where in front of the Amman we see all the people blinded, including the husband of the guy with whom the film opens actually. So this is important, that how that as long as the gaze is there, the caste, it is going to haunt. So this is something phenomenal about Marathi. That is where I think even if Lena does not provide any escape of emancipatory possibilities or imaginative possibilities, but this is a huge ending. So this I would like to talk in detail in my essay. Then of course the La Phobie is important, and we talk of representation of space, spatial practices, spaces of representation, which all of us know. But I'm interested in working on Watkins because she applies this to theater, how the conceived space is that of Lena as a director, and the perceived one of her mother, and the performative practical one of what exactly she does, her anxieties. So I'm invested in that, and I would like to end with Shami Ahmed's wonderful essay on Theyyam as this collective space for catharsis, whereas that is contrasted in Marathi, because that kind of a space is foreclosed by just only focusing on this family, and therefore also that making this oppression so real and so strong in a way for contemporary times. How from the myth, the resonance to the contemporary is so evocative and so real in Marathi. So thank you.
Thank you to all our three panelists. A very fascinating paper. Obviously, they're fairly disparate, but I think there are some common themes, particularly, I guess, all papers engage with cultural production, particularly the first paper by Sunidhi and Ishwaran, looking specifically the role of the cultural industry in India, namely cinema. And Drishadwati's exploration of the memoir as a kind of tool of articulating a certain sort of positionality, and where the interlocutor is married to a revolutionary fighter. I have just several brief observation, I think, from the papers, and then we can open up to the floor, or some questions coming up from the panelists that I might pose to you. And I think it is obvious that insofar as the film industry is concerned, we're obviously lagging behind in terms of representation of diversity, whether it's caste diversity or other forms of diversity. And very aptly, the Dalit scholar Suraj Youngdeep, as Sunidhi quoted, observed that Indian film industry has inherently been sort of very caste-based, and and as well as biased and sort of mechanized product of kind of technological industrialization in which Dalit inclusion is not the kind of moral concern. And this is, I guess, is an astute point, a comment that also implicates the Indian film industry for its complicity in sort of perpetuating the caste system and making invisible caste discrimination. And Indian cinema has had a sort of very vexed relationship with caste, and it's not surprising that sort of a canvas of films confirms that just a few castes and occupational categories are represented in this sort of portrayal in scarcely very ever compared to real social classifications. And the dominant castes become the center of the stage, and lower castes, marginalized Dalits, are not even in the scene or become voiceless for this time, heard by no one. But I guess there's a bit of change that's happening, as Sunidhi and even Ishwaran has echoed in their paper, that we're starting to see films that is giving voice, lending voice to lower castes and Dalits. And I suppose in particular, I think Sunidhi's paper and her exploration on inter-caste relationship in Tamil, in Indian cinema, specifically to, where a partner is of Dalit background, I think it also resonates with, in an interesting way with Drishti's paper, right, where the woman is the sort of the main sort of object of analysis here, and in particular, I guess who is able to speak and who can speak and who is heard, and I think it's something that came to my mind. So obviously we know that there's far more films that focus on Dalit men's relationship with upper caste women, as opposed to Dalit women's relationship with upper caste men. And so that is again a big question mark, that or a void, I guess, that he has yet to fill in. I guess what Dalit sort of Sunidhi concludes here is how Dalit women continue to be represented as sexually impure, passive, victims of abuse, silent, and voiceless. And I think this sort of raises important questions on the position of Dalit women vis-a-vis the cultural industry or popular culture, through cultural production, and I guess the kind of multiple oppression, right, they face based on class, caste, and gender, right, which some of those Dalit men who do have relationship with upper caste women kind of escape, right? That they're hailed as representative of the entire Dalit movement, and in that sense, the women are silenced. So I guess the kind of question, if Dalit men are finding voice through recent cinema, and I think we see that also in the case of Tamil cinema, can the Dalit women speak? And that's the kind of question I might want to put to Sunidhi. As for Drishadwati, I think very engaging, but at the same time, I would say quite an abstract paper in the sense that it is obviously bringing in the sort of the philosophical reading of the purpose of a memoir, the voice of the author, and their positionality and so forth. And I just also wondered then, yes, the memoir itself, right? It's really where Malika is outpouring without any inhibition the kind of up and down she had with her partner, right? The Dalit Panthers leader. So yeah, it's almost a kind of unvarnished story of a marriage and of a woman and a writer seeking her own space in a man's world, isn't it? And a lot of what she conveys through her memoir is not asking for pity, but or sympathy, but actually weaving out the fabric of her abusive marriage, and she doesn't quite shy away from speaking out. Nambiru Dazal, and who meant to be, meant to fight caste discrimination. So she's, very, very much unafraid to be unabashedly herself, even if her opinion seems to be controversial or claiming her identity. So I guess, my question then is, in terms of the spirit of the conference, where you might want to situate her memoir, her speaking position, right, to the kind of anti-caste politics or other Dalit women, right, who may not have that sort of space or opportunity to convey the kind of their sort of situation. As for Swaranwale, I think I'm fairly familiar with the Tamil cinema sort of landscape, and obviously we know quite contrary to Bollywood or some other cinemas of the north, we find caste is always present in Tamil cinema, particularly in the during the sort of Dravidian period in the 50s and 60s. Very explicit anti-caste rhetoric, anti-Brahmin, anti-Hindi sort of films were made, and these were the kind of bastion of the Dravida political parties, DMK and AIDMK, and the self-respect movement and so forth. And then we see a shift in the 1990s where suddenly we see caste, particularly the sort of marital or martial castes of the Devas and so forth in Madurai being almost celebrated. So films like Devar Magan and so on appears in the 1990s, and they become very valorized. So it's interesting that now we see a group of emerging directors like Leena Manimehalai, Mari Selvaraj, Paranjit, and Nayanar, Gopi Nayanar. They're engaging in films that specifically deal with Dalit communities or Dalit issues. So I think, your idea of creating this a subgenre, which is very specific to the Trinelveli region, I think is interesting. So I'm just wondering whether is that what is the nature of that sort of precedence, right? So we already have, there's a Chennai and there's a south of Chennai sort of dichotomy. To what extent that this then plays out? Are we having a trichotomy, so to speak, or is it still about Dalitness tied to rurality, right? to the rural part of India, where a lot of that exploitation, a lot of the discrimination, particularly, I mean, the film that you're reading closely, it just, it stares in your face how, in 2021 to have that level of oppression and discrimination, it breaks your heart, right? And and what happens to caste, to Dalit identities and other lower caste in the urban centers, right? In Chennai, in Delhi, and so on. So with that, I'll just maybe let you guys respond, and then I could move to some of the questions. If you want to say a few things, and I'll focus on the chat as well. Speakers, you might, if you want to respond.
Who would go first?
Maybe in the, sorry.
I can go. Okay, so I will start. So I will, maybe you asked two questions, like before your first, like the most important question, you asked like a sub question or a preface to a question.
Yeah.
So I would say that, while there is an emphasis, there's a lot of emphasis on, making one's voice heard and give expression to one's own self. I think it is done in a certain kind of way that expression is another experience of self-destruction, because while she's talking about her marriage, she's extremely like reticent about it, and she's like, she as if she is somehow like stripping herself naked. It's a very difficult thing to do. So it's like, it's not like, a stable ego is foregrounded. It's more of a like a very damaged kind of a person, damaged life, damaged relationship. That is what is coming out. So it's not a very integrated self that's coming out. It's not a very stable ego. And secondly, where should I locate her? I would locate her as a critical interlocutor of a certain kind of anti-caste politics that is also found in, like, in some of the communist ethics, where where you privilege individual sacrifice, individual martyrdom, individual revolutionary, personae, and 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 part of it is also very masculine. And and the woman's consent is not taken seriously on these occasions. So that's where I would put her, like, as a critical interlocutor of these kind of persona-centric martyr, the politics that privileges martyrdom and sacrifice, and also sacrifice of the others. So that's it.
Sunidhi, or
Sunidhi, you want to go, Sunidhi?
You can go, Professor Iswaran.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Selvaraj, for that question. It is very important, to keep in mind our history, which I claim is very unique. That is all over the world. If you look at subnationalism as a topic, has been discussed, through art cinema. Very famously, the third cinema movement in Latin America. Denunciatory and political and underground cinema. But Parasakti is unique because, that it spoke of subnationalism in the mainstream. It was released in 40 theaters, where it did more than 50 days, and in Ceylon it ran for 175 days. So it was very unique, and therefore, the Dravidian genre of films that set the trend, for talking about politics, in mainstream and reaching people. And today, more than 5 decades after, we see, the great Paranjit, doing that in mainstream, with his Kala and Kabali. Of course, he has done with Atakati, a more indie film as well, and Madras. So I think that is, in a way, you look at it, you can look at it as a continuity of a trajectory, but also questioning and deconstructing, the earlier kind of films as well, in terms of the aesthetics, because he comes from a Master of Fine Arts, painting background. He is definitely interested in the rhetoric, but more interested also in the form of cinema itself. In the way, for example, he would have the Ghana songs picturized and the colorful energy will bring. And Ranjit is producing, this film. Periyar and Perumal, coming back to my subject, because of time, I just limited the focus to Madati. The second half is, of course, about, Amar Selvaraj, who I think is a prodigiously, talented and gifted writer as well as a filmmaker. So, to answer your second question, that is, Mari Selvaraj also complicates our understanding of, the rurality or the rural spaces, because, if you look at Periyar and Perumal, the interaction revolving around, the Chattakalluri, the law college, is Tirunelveli itself, which, now is like, any other big cities, So he punctuates, those statues of leaders. And also he kind of, invokes the great, great leaders who were erased, like Emmanuel Sarr, So that history of, Pallas has also been erased, because it is always the discourse between Parayars and others. So this voice is also very important. That is where I think the specificity of the discourse surrounding Tirunelveli comes in. Why do you mark it as a subgenre? And also, that the foregrounding of these voices and marking them as Dalits is extremely important, because Tirunelveli has this poignantly, casteist and very sad, very violent history. In recent years, you can think of, Manjolai tea estate. You can think of, the Tamarabani River, over which, many interesting documentaries like by my friend Srinivasan was made, how, Dalits have been, forced, violently, into drowning into that river, which marks, Tirunelveli's entire, history of literature, art. So voices coming from, these spaces and addressing that, I think, is very important. That is what I would say makes it very special, these films. And in the case of Lena, unlike, say, Mari as an enunciator from Puliangulam, and, shooting the film in the place where he shot, invoking that village, she comes from outside. But yet, she evokes Tirunelveli as a space, but also she is more invested in a mythical space, more than so her emplacement, is both, like from the angle as a feminist, and also going back to her own roots. That is, she is matching the forest and other shots near the place where she was born, in Virudhunagar. So that I find is interesting. Somewhere, I mean, they want to put themselves also in the film, that through space. So this I found, very fascinating. So thank you for that, question. Thank you.
Thank you. Sunidhi, just a very quick reply, because there's a string of questions we've got to the panelists. So,
thank you so much, Professor Selvaraj, and thank you to my panelists for those engaging papers, and it was really a pleasure to listen to them. And so coming to the conclusion that you offered towards the end of the panel, Professor Selvaraj, you spoke about representations and how I'm pointing at the lack of representations in mainstream Bollywood cinema. And I know that we will be getting to the questions very soon, but one of the questions is also on representations. And to that, I wanted to respond in the sense that even when we are talking about representations, I don't think it is exactly mimetic representations, in the sense that this is the reality and this is how you should be showing it on the screen, but more so about what is imagined as something that needs to be seen, or that is wanted by the audience to be seen. So in that, I'm trying to connect the patriarchal unconscious as described by Laura Mulvey, in which she is talking about the dual pleasures of viewing, which redefines patriarchy as not just which redefines patriarchy as one that is premised on sexual difference. So women's characters as posited vis-a-vis men to put that sexual difference to begin with. Right. So that is why the representations of women in, say, Hollywood cinema when she studies turn out to be like that. And I feel that that kind of a dual pleasures of looking, in which the second pleasure of looking, which is to have the signifier be presented in a way that there is some kind of a almost sadistic way in looking that is reproduced constantly by the Brahmanic unconscious as it works in the cultural industry of India, in the sense that there's a very small example. And so when I'm talking about representations, that's why I'm trying to make a difference between, say, mainstream Bollywood cinema, parallel cinema, which is also called the socially conscious cinema, and the third, regional or regional cinema, which also is perforating into the mainstream, but which is either created or influenced by Dalit actors or social movements. So in that, one very small difference when you actually do start portraying Dalit feminism. So a movie like Kala, in that there is this person called Tufani, and in that when the fight is happening, there is a small part where the people try to pull off clothes, and sexual violence is portrayed in that way. But in something like Patal Lok, now this is not a movie, but there the actors clearly have a cast, and the dynamics of that has been shown. And in that, like say a upper caste woman being sexually harassed or some kind of a sexual violence being meted out to her, like most of the films, is signified by a dupatta falling, as in the loss of honor or respect. On the other hand, when the Dalit woman is being raped, she is shown from a 360-degree angle and throughout the entire act. So that is so though the caste is being marked, there is some kind of a conscience creating exercise that these actors are trying to do, be it in Shyam Benegal's trilogy or in the parallel cinema, the socially conscious cinema, or these visuals. There's a constant reproduction of that Dalit woman as a victim, Dalit woman as the abused body, and there is a somehow there's somehow a pleasure in looking at that body as if the structures and everything makes sense, everything falls in place. So I think that is the Brahmanic unconscious that is produced even when Dalit women are marked caste gendered identities in the culture industry. So that is what I would like to say. I do not know if it addresses, but that is one of the questions of which a part of it addresses. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just move on very quickly to questions from the audience. First to Drishadwati. This one's for you. It says, how do we engage with the positive memory of caste-based oppressed communities? Perhaps the focus only on reinscribing the trauma of violence as all-encompassing memory limits our understanding of the resilience of the oppressed and their positive memory and history.
Okay, so I thought the last example that I showed where, where she is talking about Hasal like spending all his money to buy food for this stranded boys, stranded like people, and the way she kind of, she's both shocked, appalled by that kind of Christ-like moment in her husband's life, because obviously they will not have any more money to eat from that after that. But I think that that's a moment where this ambiguity comes up, where on the one hand you show this like this moment of ethics, this absurd act of goodness, like that shines through like her narrative. So this is like one moment where you give food to the strangers, so it's like one moment of a new sociality is formed, because you don't know, because it's like a stranger sociality is being formed. But again, this is also like a moment that's for a woman who has to place food at the table, or for somebody who is running the household. Just think of it, there will be no money for her or for the family, and they have a child too. So how would she react to this? So I think this this memoir like takes away such, there are these autobiographies that talk about the wonderful love of Dalit women, and there are the autobiographies that do not address these. I think this narrative is somewhere in the middle. It tries to kind of tackle both these issues, like what happens in the Dalit home, how is love, and how is like how are good acts like experienced in these moments. So it tries to kind of it tries to caution against such valorization of good memories also, like, and those are also coming up during like, we have like people who have written like good things about Dalit homes, and also it's a critique of that too.
Well, thank you. Just a general question. It says, with regards to space, instead of asking, can Dalit women speak, shouldn't we be asking, when will Dalit women be heard? Will they have to wait for Dalit men to first find space in mainstream media?
Yes, I agree. Shall I, Sunidhi, you want to answer?
Yeah.
No, you please go ahead.
Yes, yeah. Drishadwati?
Oh, this one. Okay, so I would say that you can't just wait for revolution. You can't privilege one revolution and say, let's have this first, and then you are simply, I think ethics is something that has to be in the present. It's like you do it now or you don't do it. You defer it, then you privilege one politics over another. So we can't, I think that if we keep on saying that let this happen first and then we'll see other things, then we are obviously privileging certain voices and erasing certain voices. So I would not say, I would say no to that. Yeah.
Yes, from to this question, that about since I come from film studies, I can say that Ranjit himself is now producing films, for young Dalit women filmmakers, come from which I think is now a documentary. So those kind of interventions are now happening. So I'm sure we'll see robust kind of filmmaking from that area soon, both in the documentary as well as fiction form. Though I agree, I mean that as in the papers, Sunidhi pointed out that it has taken such a long time, for a Dalit presence actually, that even now, if you look at it, that Ranjit has done in the mainstream, Kala and Kapali, Paranjit, whereas Article 15 still does not have a Dalit protagonist in Hindi cinema. So even there, as with Parasakti, I think Tamil cinema has led that. So I am sure that we'll have young filmmakers. While at the same time, that it always harkens back to the iconic Gayatri Chakravarti's question regarding can the subaltern speak, and her theorization of strategic essentialism and the discourses surrounding that. So I agree, it's a very important question. Yes.
Sunidhi, do you want to respond, or shall I move to the next question?
Please move to the next question.
This one for the whole panelists. How do the panelists reconcile the idea of a subaltern cultural identity with the fact that it also is oppressive of women and at the same time closely linked with their identity? Of course, the subaltern deities are a remarkable part of this, but how do they see the enduring system of Devadesis and Matmas and Vaishnavis in parts of Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and so on in the 21st century? Anyone?
Yes, that is particularly, Tirunelveli is very famous for, it's a land of small gods, as Arundhati Roy would say. You will have, the small gods and palm trees, it is marked by, that image. And Madathi is an example. Since I'm, addressing that film, I thought that I would address this, question as well. But here you have, that various, different kind of goddesses. Of course, if you go back to the roots, many of them come back as, women, with that project of vengeance or vendetta because of, the harm that has been done. Essentially, some of the folklore stories revolve around intercaste marriages, how the Brahmin or the Villala or the air caste, men even killed, these women. Or in the case of, the most iconic Neeli, it is about, as a businessman husband, trying to cheat, and he kills her, and then she waits and comes back again and takes her vengeance, and then she's the goddess. So the only difference we can see is that if a man has this predicament, like in Madurai Veeran, immediately he will become a god. But in the case of women, they have to also loiter in the in-between space of being the spectral figure. Famously, the image of waiting on the tree for years. So even there, they are not given this kind of space, for they have to wait, and and then finally they get into this. So you can see, the patriarchal mind, in the way all this has been designed, and also the way it has been processed, by the people as they receive. But Madathi questions that, by cutting immediately towards the end, after, the rape and death of, the young Marathi figure, Yosna herself, immediately it is to the goddess, and we see all these people blinded right in front of her. They cannot now have the pleasure of, even, worshipping, this deity they made out of, their guilt. So that, I think, is one of the ways, feminists and writers have been trying to address, and filmmakers particularly, has addressed it this way. There are many other ways, and there have been, recently some wonderful books as well, on this topic of deities and, about agency at all, if it is there, that.
Thank you. Sunidhi, or that's a question for you, Sunidhi. Can we call movies like Karnan, Parayarum Perumal, Kala, Sairat, Ambedkarite? If yes, that what will be the set of framework to decide such movies are Ambedkarite movies? Because Ambedkarism is so wide and covers social, political, religious, gender, and many other aspects.
Right. So that is a very good question. And so I think my answer to that would be that I don't think I have the authority to classify films as Ambedkarite or not. But then what I've tried to do in my paper is that I have tried to differentiate between the three kinds of cinema, which is one being the mainstream Hindi Bollywood cinema, second being the parallelly conscious, socially conscious parallel cinema, generally produced by Abakas, and the third one being cinema in which there is some kind of an influence. It's either made by or influenced by Dalit persons. And yeah, so and technically I do speak about the characters being Ambedkarite. And the person who's asking the question is really right when they say that Ambedkarism is wide and covers social, political, religious, gender, and many aspects. So in that sense, though they may not be the protagonist like Mukta's movie Milind, who is an Ambedkarite activist, they themselves, in the way that they want to uphold the dignity of themselves, and they want to aspire to higher education, be it in Periyar and Perumal, when he goes and he says he wants to become like Babasaheb Ambedkar. If I'm not wrong, I don't have very exact memory of it, but there are these small ways in which the Ambedkarite consciousness of the protagonist has been developed, because these movies are either created or influenced by Dalit persons or the anti-caste movement.
Thank you so much. I think we've been told to wind up. Just want to say a big thank you. And we had quite a lot of questions, and probably we might have to move on to the next panel. And thank you again for your very interesting contribution to kickstart the conference.
Thank you, Selvaraj. Thank you, Sunidhi.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Jai Bhim to everyone.
Enjoy the conference. Yeah.